So for everyone who's on here, Karen as well as Desing Knights are part of the West Virginia Food Safety Training Team. So they're friends of ours, but I noticed several other people on here. So I'm really excited to see a huge outpouring of people from Kentucky State, because I know a bunch of people over there, and we've got people from all over the place, which is really exciting for us. All right, so Cindy, we're up to module C. We have 2 modules and we are done.
Yep, and
So
hopefully, I think we've set a lot of the groundwork, so these will
yeah,
go fairly well. A couple of points, thinking about your larger produce operations that may have shared cell phones or radios for emergency and crowd and communication reasons. Shared microphones if you're doing any kind of guided tours on your farm. Those are all other surfaces that are going to come in contact with some of those respiratory particles. And so, if they're shared, what are you going to do about it? If they're not shared, then, you've got sole use. But providing folks with the ability to clean and sanitize is also something you might want to consider.
and
So,
interestingly enough, going and looking at some of the other industries that utilize some of that equipment as well and learn how they're doing it, because I ran across a recording studio that's a shared use facility they rent out, and they went through how they clean and sanitize all of their equipment, including microphone covers. So just know there are other people doing these things, and we can learn from the other industries.
so with that, that's a perfect, just a quick couple of notes. First of all, uh, anything that we talk about today is not considered a substitute for what is already in place on a produce farm. So we're talking about enhancements, and as folks start to lessen those requirements or strategies that they're doing, it doesn't mean that you get to go back and totally eliminate what you're already doing. In other words, if you had a cleaning and sanitizing schedule and you chose to enhance it, as things are becoming more commonplace in terms of toning that down a little bit, you don't get to delete that whole procedure on the operation. You will just revert back to what you were doing pre-COVID when you determine that that's where you want to be. So during the break, I got an email, and it was a monthly newsletter that I get from our Division of Tourism. And you say, Cindy, what does that have to do with what we're talking about with produce safety? Well, I quoted you some figures a little earlier. We know that travelers not only are traveling further, but they're also looking for the activities and locations that are located in our rural communities, because perception, which is true, that uh, our farms and our rural communities offer more opportunity for better social distancing is true. So they're looking to us. They're looking to come out to our farms. They're looking to come out to our rural communities. And your farm has an impact on the community, whether it's people going to the farmer's market or people coming onto your farm to visit, to do a pumpkin patch tour or pick your own. So this is results this week from Longwoods is the organization that the West Virginia Division of Tourism uses for research. So 2 words describe how Americans are regarding and feeling towards travel: optimistic and cautious. That's exactly what we're doing with our growers. 88% of travelers are taking trips within the next 6 months. So that's gone up in a week. Um, However, tourists are still taking precautions when it comes to the pandemic. So that tourist, you could also equate that to the customer at the farmer's market. Around 57% of folks surveyed reported that they are unlikely to visit places or attractions without clear requirements or protocols in place. Since American travelers, 58%, are feeling safer traveling outside of their community, indicators are moving in a positive direction. So we have a product, and you have products that travelers are interested in. And when you combine it with the next statement that I'm about to make, it really is impactful on our growers, whether they're doing agritourism or not. And that says that the governor of the state of West Virginia has released a reduction in restrictions for buffet bars. How does that impact you? Well, we all know that during the initial stages of the pandemic, the whole food chain system in the US was thrown into disarray. And folks had lots of greens and salad bar items that they were totally looking forward to putting into the restaurant and food service industry and schools as a part of their sales channel, and those dried up almost overnight. So this is an opportunity for those those sales outlets to reopen. So you want to make sure that when the school or the restaurateur comes to you and says, "What are you doing for COVID-19?" And, can I feel comfortable buying your product again to put out on my buffet bar? That has a huge impact on production planning, production harvesting, all those things. So they're all interrelated. And so that's some good news, at least in West Virginia. So, Barbara, do you want to introduce this? Oh, no.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
oh, that's
Sorry,
fine.
this is going to be the third module where we're talking about where there is a potential for COVID transmission. Hasn't been proven, but there is the potential. Plus, no matter what, it's always a good refresher to talk about cleaning, sanitizing, and possibly disinfecting spaces and equipment because that is a food safety risk. So, Cindy,
And
your
sure.
learning
So
objectives.
there's some overlap here.
Yes.
So we know that we're going to look at a slide again, and we know that it's a potential source, not proven at this point. So we'll review that real quick. We're going to look at a refresher on cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting. We're going to look at those existing procedures that folks may already have in place in the production, harvesting, package, storage, and transportation function as they relate to SARS-CoV. We're going to look at those contact surfaces and talk about some strategies there in terms of some enhancements. And we're going to look at the modifications, the ability to train, and also monitor and adjust. Next slide. So this is again from module number 1, and Barbara identified 4 potential places where transmission can occur, although 2 of them have been deemed pretty irrelevant in terms of having any cases. But we also know that there's a huge potential in the surface area, mainly because we're talking about areas where employees tend to have to cluster. So I'm thinking about a harvest field. Okay, you're going to have a congregation of employees. I'm thinking about a packing line. I'm thinking about an on-farm market. So those are all places where there are surfaces, there are interactions with either employees or visitors, and we want to look at what we're already doing for those areas, but also thinking about how we can provide some enhanced COVID strategies. So we know that transmission and environmental impacts are important. So we're looking at humidity and the air density and how long those particles can hang out. We also want to look at what kind of environmental impacts are on those surfaces. Are you in a warm environment? Are you in a cold environment? And again, we know that COVID happens to be one that thrives in cold, but there are a lot of other pathogens that thrive in that heat and moisture environment. So just looking at all of that again from that 360 helicopter view of your operation. So we know that that any of those surfaces, no matter what the pathogen, can be transmitted through humans, soil, animals, water, tools, equipment, those packing lines, and other mechanical processes that we use, and the packaging materials. Now, can you get COVID from packing materials? We're hoping that at the farm we've already made those strategies happen in terms of storage where that's not going to happen. But what happens to packing material that have exposure post distribution or post actual packing? What happens in terms of what does that packaging have to withstand in terms of pathogen exposure after it leaves your farm. Next slide. So we've already looked at those areas. We know that the employees are the number one, and method and concern that we have, and we adjust that all in module 2. So let's look at those other things that you need to think about. So this is a story of a harvest bin. A harvest bin, in this case, was in an apple orchard. And so when we harvested it, we had a couple of things that we could do. First of all, on the upper left, you can see where there's a hydrocool unit. And this is where the produce comes in from the field. And to get the field heat out, it's going through a process where it's being exposed to, sometimes it's ice, sometimes it's cool water. We're trying to get that field heat out and reduce the possibility of spoilage and pathogens. But this also creates a contact point with that fruit to a mechanical device. So we have to consider that and maybe the water source or the ice source in terms of potential pathogen entry points to that produce. So thinking about that particular field to packing line process is important to think about. This particular apple was harvested into a large wooden bin. So we have the issue of how do we clean and sanitize that? Um, there are some SOPs out there that you can have access to provide folks with examples. Um, it's obviously not the most ideal, but it is what is out there. And so how can we look at that in terms of reducing the risk of pathogen introduction? Also in this picture, you can see there's also a hand process where we're transferring from that wooden bin to a consumer pack or a display pack. So we're looking at the material that is made up where that produce is going into that contact surface. Um, Bottom left, we're looking at folks that are using plastic bins that are obviously easily washable and disinfectable and sanitizable, but at the same time are the SOPs in a place so that it happens every time. And also we're introducing these particular crates to a cooling unit. So these are going into a large refrigerated storage facility. The last one we have here is that produce is also going into some kind of a transport vehicle, most likely, unless you're doing exclusively on-farm direct sales. So it's going into a reefer. It's going into a unit that has not only surfaces, but it also is exposing your particular produce to a refrigeration unit. There's condensation, there's heat, there's temperature control. But I also want you to think about it. What if this was a vehicle coming from the field into your packing house? So what are we doing with that produce while it's sitting in the truck, maybe out in the field for a couple hours, and then it's coming into a packing line? How are we getting it out? What are we doing to that vehicle in between? Do we have people that have human contact with that produce? That are in the back of that vehicle, making sure that it's packed correctly. Just lots of areas to think about. In addition to the actual packing line, you've got a lot of mechanical processes that are happening. So again, more exposure, more contact surface. Next slide. So what can you do? What do we look at as we do that assessment? We're going to look at how we're harvesting our product. Are we using individual knives? Are we using a mechanical device? What is the procedure for that to happen? What happens once it's picked? If you've had some PSA training, has everybody been trained to know when there's a contaminated area, when you do your pre-harvest assessment, where there's warning flags in reference to animal and wildlife intrusion? So all of those kinds of things need to kind of be lined out in terms of a procedure and also effectively communicated, i.e. training and reinforcement for any person and equipment that comes into contact. What does your packing house flow look like? That hydrocool unit, it was elevated. So how does the produce get up to that hydro unit? How does it get down from that hydro unit onto the packing house conveyor? Lots of things to look at in terms of how that works. Your packing line. How tight is it? How many employees do you have on it? Is there an opportunity for you to socially distance? Where are your restrooms in relation to that packing line? Does someone in the middle have to go all the way outside or all the way to another building in order to use the restroom or the locker room facilities? What are your transportation plans? Do you have, we all know that part of that food chain continuum disruption that happened with COVID also means that transportation issues are huge. There's a huge backup at our ports because we can't get shipping containers turned around in time to be able to get those to go out. And so we also have a huge backup at those ports in terms of unloading. So you may have perishable product that you're introducing into your packing house or your outlets that you need to think about. Material and supply storage controls. I gave you the example of being able to get bottles for maple syrup. A plastic bottle, if you want to get a pallet of them, right now, if you order, you're going to look at post 2022 to get them. What is your pest and contaminant control program? You should have that already in place. But with COVID, are we allowing garbage and refuge to overflow because we're using so many disposable items? And is that attracting rodents and other pests? Plans that you already have in place to monitor, correct, and review are all going to need to be looked at and updated, and looking at it from a COVID perspective. So we went ahead and asked a couple of key questions. I'm not sure we have time to go through this in terms of responding, but these are questions that you can ask growers that can help them start to think about these items. So where can it be introduced in your farm? And hopefully you've covered a lot of that in module 2, but now let's look at it from a building and an infrastructure perspective. And then what additional steps can I take that's going to enhance my current process as it relates to these contact surfaces? Next slide. So your sanitation SOP should already be in place. If they're not written, creativity as an ag service provider is going to be a wonderful thing at this point. How do you get them to write it down? Do you get them to bullet point it? Do you get them to speak into a recording device? What are those operating procedures? What are the steps, and how does that work currently? And again, most folks are doing it. They'll tell you, oh yeah, I clean my harvest knives every time I get out of the field. Well, what do you clean them with? Are they sanitized? Are they disinfected? Where are they stored? Those are the kinds of things that you want to walk your growers through in terms of making sure that they have some procedures in place and that they're documented and can be trained. And then
And also, especially key on the store one, because that came up in a talk this week I listened to about the sheaths not being cleaned. And so they'd have a clean and sanitized harvest knife, and it went into a sheath that had no way of protecting it. And so it could have transferred anything to it. So
when our family had an FDA inspected commercial kitchen for food production, that was one of the areas that they would always go into the drawer where you stored your utensils, and when was the last time you cleaned the drawer, and when was the last time you hung the knives on the wall, when was the last time you cleaned the top of that holder, those kinds of things. So just kind of that deep look into what's going on. You're going to have to make sure that you've got disinfecting and sanitizing at the end of the continuum, because you've got to clean first. And I have that quote up there. It's one of my favorite. I love the little prince. And there's a long quote that leads up to it, and it talks about the heart. But I also think it's very relevant to what we're doing, working with our growers in produce safety. And that is, what is essential is invisible to the eye, be it the COVID asymptomatic employee, and it also could be what is on a surface. So assess the effectiveness of your current SOPs, invite your growers to explore them, provide them with resources to develop them, modify and create, make sure that there's some kind of documentation. And again, you might have to get creative, train, monitor, and redirect, retrain, or modify. Next slide. So those of you that have been involved in any kind of food safety training, it doesn't matter if it's produce or otherwise, we all know that there are several steps to the preventive measures that you're going to do in terms of a cleaning process. We all know it has to start with that cleaning step. We love this graphic because I think it's very visual. It kind of shows how you're actually at each step reducing pathogens or potential contaminants. We're going to remove the dirt at the cleaning level. We're going to sanitize it to address some bacteria and viruses. And we're going to go ahead and disinfect to destroy even more. And you have to get to the disinfectant level for COVID-19.
Actually, you may not. They're backing off on that one. But what is key is cleaning and sanitizing. It depends on it, and you have to be careful. The disinfecting, again, is the harshest one of the three. But if you had something like norovirus, then you have to disinfect. It turns out what they're starting to say now is cleaning and sanitizing will probably deal with most of the COVID in there. But
yeah, so for folks that already have a cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting practice, SOP, if you're at that level, you want to keep there.
Because you've got all the other pathogens to deal with.
Exactly. So that's why we aspire to these 3 steps, even though we're looking at the fact that we're pretty sure that the sanitizing step is going to take care of a lot of the COVID. But again, COVID isn't our only concern.
Right.
So again, following this continuum is going to be essential, and for you to continue to communicate that to your growers. Next slide. So high touch surfaces that you need to think about. These are areas, again, you're going through that 360 assessment. You're looking at all the different places of the operation, and they may or may not need to be addressed because they may have already been part of a process, or it may not be relevant to the operation that you're working on. Again, we're looking at individuals. So field vehicles is the big one. So there are lots of resources out there, and we're including them in the toolkit of how you would properly clean a harvest vehicle. So it's pretty funny because I'm working with my brother-in-law on an auction company, and one of the items that we have that just came up was a beautiful grain truck. And when I say that, it's an old one, but what amazed him was when he got into the cab, it was immaculate. Immaculate. And how many of you have gotten into a harvest vehicle or driven a grain wagon and you haven't figured out what the previous employee that was in there had for dinner the night before at the local fast food place? So those field vehicles are notorious for not particularly being the cleanest vehicles you'll ever be in. So there's a whole visual that we'll provide for you in the resources where it tells you how to clean a field vehicle that is shared use. And that's the important thing to remember, shared use. So we encourage you to look at that. It's hard to do a deep clean, but it's one of those areas where you don't think about it, but there's a lot of one-on-one contact. You may have people riding in the cab, 3 of them at a time, all those kinds of things. So if you need to relive your field harvest days, that's probably a good place to do it, and start with, where am I at in my surface evaluation.
And don't forget, field vehicle isn't just trucks.
Oh, yes.
There. It could also be any kind of other small vehicle you're using, Cub Cadet that's pulling something, a Gator, etc. So think broadly in there. All right, number 2.
Yeah. Number 2, the packing shed. You got dolly handles. How many of you have people that are using dollies in their operation to get stuff from one point to the other. Coolers, your refrigeration units, and uh, uh, even at a retail operation, those walk-in I'm sorry, those hand coolers where you're displaying items for folks to go in and get their produce. Door handles, light switches, scale buttons. And I would also think about adding in phone and communication surfaces. That was a good point by one of our previous listeners. In your greenhouse, you've got that watering wand. How many times did it end up on the ground? You've got um, handles for your high tunnel and your germination chambers, vent openers, plastic rising and lowering devices for your high tunnels. Think about those surfaces. The office, and this is where the phones come in again, the keyboard, the mouse, we've all seen the studies about how those areas are highly shared use in many cases, and also probably some of the dirtier items you're going to find in the produce operation. And we'll talk about a possible strategy to mitigate that. Your restrooms, we all know that we're not just talking to the ones that are open to the public, but your employees. And again, this is kind of an overlap. We know that's a congregation place. We know that environmentally, the environment may you can't control a lot of the humidity and that kind of thing. A lot of times you don't have the adequate ventilation, so those are places to look at those surfaces. What are you currently doing, and what will you enhance based on the surface and personnel interaction? Tools and equipment, I think we've gone through that, but you also need to think about your sorting tables, your harvest totes and buckets. Are you using the same ones, or are you putting them back into the operation? Is there a procedure to clean in between? You've got clippers, knives. You've got the rubber bands that you would do if you were harvesting a bunch item. I'm thinking of oh, help me out, Barbara. When we were up in Maryland, what
Oh,
were they?
something like cilantro.
Yeah, exactly. It's done by bunching and using some kind of an elastic device
Yeah.
to bunch it up for retail sale. And then touch screens, retail, uh, entering your code into a credit card machine. All of those places are things to think about sanitizing regularly, and also making cleaning a regular part of it, and then looking at whether or not you need to go to that next step of sanitizing, and even more so disinfecting. Again, it's an evaluation of what that operation is doing. Next slide. So we talk about disinfectants. We know that that's the highest level. Um, there's been a lot of as Barbara mentioned in the first module, folks using household bleach to wash their produce. So in addition to educating our employees on our procedures, sometimes it's a need to educate your consumers. So on the farm, as we're looking at this, we always want to follow those EPA approved um, application instructions, reading the directions, making sure that you're using the correct disinfectant for the correct purpose. We're going to look at the contact time. We're going to look at the dilution. We're also always going to make sure that we're not trying to disinfect a dirty surface. We're always going to make sure we have that cleaning step in there. We're also going to make sure that we are aware of our applicator safety with gloves and washing your hands, again, based on the EPA and manufacturer suggestions. And we're also going to make it so that there's no chance of that particular disinfectant coming into contact with the produce. So we're going to keep it locked away. We're going to make sure there's no seepage. We're going to make sure that the labels stay on the product. All of those good kinds of things. So this is a nice graphic from the EPA that talks about effective, correct usage of disinfectants. Next slide. So Barbara and I have actually gone to this list N that the EPA puts out, and they have a list of disinfectants that are effective against SARS-CoV-2. and COVID-19. Um, there's a disclaimer, as I just said, using it according to the label, but there are some options that we've listed out here that are on that Schedule N or List N. We will provide the link to that because they are updating it as they determine the efficacy of new sanitizers on the market or are able to evaluate its effectiveness with current ones
And
related
make
to COVID.
sure if it's going on a food contact surface, it is a cleaner that's approved for a food contact surface. So the other list that we will also supply is the PSA list, but that does not have directions to the EPA list of disinfectants against SARS-CoV-2, but it does have the food safety um, food food contact surface list in there. So it's a tough one, but that N list includes every disinfectant. So what janitors use in, cleaning restrooms at your school or at the airport, et cetera, that's all in there as well as anything else. It's just the total list.
So that's why that bullet point, use according to the label, is so important. So the thing you're on emphasize continually is whether you're looking at sanitizers or disinfectants, you're looking at food grade. They need to be able to be used on not only necessarily food, but also produce, making sure that it's not going to affect the integrity and the quality of the product. So there are some food grade sanitizers and disinfectants that are just not recommended for produce because they're going to deteriorate it. We've listed three options here. We wanted to point out the Clorox. Those that are in West Virginia will tell you that WIF has done an admirable job in researching Clorox. First of all, it has to be brand specific that we list here. It also has to be non-fragrant or no scent. And there's some very specifics there about the concentration and those kinds of things. So even when you read this, you think, oh, I can just use Clorox. Well, it's important to reiterate that that is not the truth. The other thing is to remember that you have to do it according to the label in terms of dilution. Um, you know, uh, Back to that commercial kitchen I was telling you about. Uh, the joke still is my mother is the queen of bleach, but she also likes to not do it according to dilution recommendations. And so when you walked into her kitchen, you could smell that it was clean, but she had reduced efficacy in a lot of it because it was over diluted and it wasn't done according to the label. So she got spoken to several times by the inspector about that. So just encourage people to make sure that they're following those guidelines and make sure that the owner and operator is the one that you may be talking to, but how is this getting down to the field level? How is this being implemented and monitored in the packing house? And then there's two others, including these two Barbara included because they were organic approved.
Yep.
Next slide.
And
Oh,
one last thing, just like Clorox, you have to be brand specific. Sanidate 5.0, there are other Sanidates, but this one in particular is one that's on a list that could be used. So not all Sanidate can be used with that in there.
okay, next slide. Uh, Again, we've got small and mid-sized growers that are doing open and closed packing areas. Pros and cons to both in terms of COVID. If you're open, obviously you've got that air flow uh, uh, space issue covered, but you're also introducing other things in terms of rodents and pests and debris, that kind of thing, versus a closed. And again, creates an environment that you're going to have to control in terms of humidity and temperature and those kinds of things. And also they tend to be close packed in because for space considerations and efficiencies. Does the engineering and or landscaping affect the potential transmission of SARS-CoV-2? And and the answer is yes. And I just told you ventilation systems and those kinds of things. But in terms of landscaping, I was kind of trying to figure out how that would impact your work as an ag service provider. And Barbara came up with a great one. It was a pick your own operation, and they were trying to figure out how to socially distance in the pick your own field. And most of us recognize that pick your own fields are straight lines and they're rows. And it's kind of a, I don't want to say free for all, but you open up your pick your own, people come and get containers and they go out there. And how do we utilize that space more efficiently for social distancing purposes? And so it's an increase in the number of aisles that you put in for your row crops, but also what she found one place that they created picking islands. So in other words, when you checked in, you were assigned an island, and that would have your plant material, and it would you would be in that one area, and then you could actually distance those picking islands for COVID. Now, is that terribly efficient? Maybe not, but if you're relying on pick your own and visitors to your farm, um, that might provide an opportunity for you to implement some of those processes now and in the future. The other thing is, it tends to allow the visitor to have, an experience. They're in a picking island. What a great idea. Strawberries can grow in hills, those kinds of things. Again, looking at your pest control program, that goes back to what is your scenario pre and post harvest. And again, looking at those particular areas that get a lot of high use by your staff. The break rooms, the lockers, is someone using an apron out in the field to harvest, and your procedure is when they're done with it, they hang it in their locker for the day. Is that something that you might want to look at in terms of being able to enhance it by adding a cleaning step, or do you have a cleaning service that will come in and do the laundry? Where are they putting it? Is it in a hamper? That kind of thing.
Especially if you have your staff socially distant in the field and you allow them to be without their mask out there. If they've got a harvest apron on, you may want to consider that now potentially a high risk in there because they haven't been masked because they've been out socially distant. And so putting that apron in a place so it's contained in a closed bin so it can get cleaned by somebody. Yep.
Next slide. Oh, and the other thing is, how many of you take those aprons, or how many of you have growers that take those aprons and put them in their home washing machine? So just considering whether or not, and that's not just with COVID SARE, but it's also with any kind of pathogen. Back to those, what are you already doing?
Yep.
Let's see, next slide. So packing zones, and for those of you that have done the PSA training, you know that they spend a lot of time talking about that. So those training tools and references and those kinds of things are great, and they allow you to look at those high priority areas, and those are areas that potential expiration from employees or others can come into contact with the surface. So you're looking at your packing lines, you're looking at your areas in the field where folks are cutting produce and introducing an open surface into the produce. Those are all kind of those zone 1 areas that you want to focus on, which is why we talk about things like harvest knives, and we talk about conveyor belts, and the grading and picking functions. Those are the ones that are going to have the human contact. And we also know that that's the greatest potential for respiratory contact. So it also can be fluid. Um, you know, as you're going down that packing line, there may be long stretches where they're not exposed to either human contact or any kind of surface pathogens that may exist. So remember that your zones, you're not going to say my packing line is all zone 1. You need to think about it in terms of what is happening at that particular point in the line. And then the last one, this is kind of my favorite in that, we talk about this in PSA a lot, is what used to happen versus now. And I'm guilty. Those packing boxes are not cheap. You're usually having to buy a couple hundred at a time at a minimum, and you're not using them all in one growing season. And so I remember distinctly the pallet going up into the hayloft, and it sat there all winter, and the pigeons made a nice home of them. And then you would go up go up at the next harvest season, and you would peel off the first couple and make sure that there was no debris, and you would reuse them. Well, it's important to make sure folks focus on those containers that it's going into. Um, you know, it could be clamshells, it could be jars and bottles, it could be anything, but making sure that we provide an environment where there's not any contamination. Now, we know COVID SARE probably isn't going to happen in terms of that uh, consumer contact with the pathogen, but there are other uh, pathogens that they could be harbored on those particular um, shipping and packing containers. And what happens is you may have a great product that you're putting into them that doesn't have any COVID or other pathogens, but if you introduce them into an environment where it's already there, that's when you can run into problems. Next slide. Um, storage. Storage areas are our favorite place for your pests and rodents, and it's also the place where oh, I'm done with it. I'm gonna take care. I'm gonna put it in storage until I have to put it on a truck. So making sure that you address those issues in terms of a regular routine of cleaning, sanitizing. When you do a major shipment and you have an exposed open area, that's a great time to implement a disinfecting deep clean process. Monitoring the temperature and humidity. We already know that's going to happen in something like a cooling unit for apples, but also, are there other products that are going to be highly sensitive to that? And pathogens are going to find an ideal place to be happy and grow. So monitoring that is critical, and making any adjustments, and just good overall maintenance. Map that storage layout so that staff know where to focus on in terms of anything you identify as zone one, but also any places where there's potential uh, areas for environmental issues like temperature and time and heat and cold exposure.
So the other one in that mapping the layout is because in a storage, if it's cold storage, you've got high humidity and cooler temperatures, those respiratory droplets are going to hang in there longer. And as a result, the longer your staff are in there, the more they have a chance of getting exposed to anything that could have been left, even if it's not on a surface. So having that storage layout so that everybody knows where things are, and that you have it set up so that it's easy for somebody to get what they need and get out of there without having to spend a lot of time inside is going to be really critical.
And also, it allows you to do that first in, first out.
Yeah.
So, and again, those deep cleans, the more you can do, the merrier. That makes sense. Um, Again, based on going back to module one, which is our mechanism of transmission. And so for SARS-CoV, we know that the deep cleans may or may not have to increase in frequency, but they still have to happen. Next slide. Transportation vehicles, we talked about that. We talked about other transportation vehicles that you don't think about, four-wheelers, gators, pallet jacks, especially if you're looking at a cold storage scenario. Forklifts are not in there. So with forklifts, you're not only looking at the forklift itself, but you're also looking at that driver area. So you're gonna have that individual relationship with that mechanism, in addition to any contact that it would have with the produce. Creating those disinfecting and sanitizing schedule for the vehicles. I think most people find that, especially if they have access to a fleet vehicle, that can be challenging. So again, that point person that you assign from module 2 that's in charge of that may want to be that point person to make sure that schedule is established and carried out. And you're going to have to provide the tools to make whatever you decide needs to happen in terms of cleaning supplies available to the folks that are actually in the operation implementing it. We're going to say no smoking and eating in all vehicles. You know, as an ag service provider, I think we have to continue to preach that and the importance of it. We're looking at that oral fecal transfer. We're looking at respiratory. We're looking at overall cleanliness and hygiene and the potential for it to come into contact with our produce. And
And
so
in this case, to smoke and eat, you're taking your mask off. And so if
exactly.
anybody else is in that vehicle, you're exposing them.
So, you know, and we know the reality of that. It's going to be a tough one, but you really need to encourage that. And as Barbara said, the mask implication is huge there. Monitoring is important. You know, do you have somebody who is it a person thing? Are you going to go ahead and computerize that so that people can get notification even when they're off premise? What does that do not only to the quality of your produce, but also the ability for pathogens to become an issue. And then again, those deep cleans, if you can do them, great. Next slide. Agritourism, again, a huge amount of contact surfaces. So again, going back to that assessment, the 360 view, looking at those surface areas where visitors come into most contact with. And when you combine that kind of like a map overlay of where the staff come into contact, it's going to be very clear what areas you need to focus on. You know, those entry areas, those areas where there's interaction. Excuse me, if you're doing any kind of food service, you've got those eating facilities. You've got, you know, even if you put plexiglass up and you've got a school group, you know, they're very eager to learn. And so you're going to have lots of hands on plexiglass, those kinds of things. So thinking about that in terms of where a visitor would interact with your operation if you're there as a tourist. So you may want to up the number of non-entry zones that you have. You may want to increase the number of restroom and hand wash facilities. You may want to think about pre-packaging items so that there's none of that, you know, picking through and getting that bag of apples. Uh,
One of
we
the
talked.
things you could do is, because you either have plexiglass or that plastic curtain up, clear plastic curtain up, you could actually do it like you do in the meat or fish markets, where you point at what it is you want and you have your people do the picking behind the protective surface in there. And so just modify what's been done.
In module 2, we talked about sampling, and again, encouraging folks to walk away so that when they remove those masks, they have the opportunity to safely social distance. And also, what am I going to do with those items? And that's also a great place to make sure that you have hands, some kind of sanitizer or ability for them to wipe off their hands. And then this is this is this is intuitive to what we already um, uh, suggest, or actually, in some cases, in the case of a FSMA inspection or even a GAP or third party audit, is that we have procedures in place to either notify or a process to clarify that our policy is that any dropped or picked fruit, I'm sorry, dropped produce, we don't eat. And at this point, you know, considering how your picking is, you know, if you have an apple orchard, maybe you're still going to allow folks to pick, but you're not going to encourage them to eat in the field. And if you're doing something like raspberries or blueberries or those smaller items, um, picking and eating is definitely not going to be encouraged. Again, they're going to be lowering their mass. Off farm, this is, you know, the folks that are going to the farmers market. And again, there's a lot of overlap here. We're looking at prepackaged or pre-sold items. Folks know what's available. We're coming to the market on Saturday. We've got abundance of carrots, you know, a bundle for $4 or whatever. And so then when they get there, you've already got their box it's almost a modified CSA. It's the payment method that's different, but that whole idea that you're able to prepackage their order, so when they get there, you just have to transfer the items. Separate containers. Thinking about if you're harvesting apples and you're taking them to the farmer's market, you're going to sell them by the bag instead of a bin. Uh, what are you going to do in terms of having PPE and hand sanitizer available for the staff, a hand wash station? Are you going to pack some extra in the truck so that it's always there? And if someone forgets to pack it, you've got a backup. Um, your retail display containers, making sure that they're food grade, that they're cleanable, sanitizable, and disinfectable. Um, you know, uh, you need to think about that in terms of how you're retailing, but also considering those items that need to be taken care of post market. Uh,
Hang
again,
on.
more.
Let me take in. So having locations to help dispose of whatever PPE you use off the farm in there. So the masks, if gloves are used, etc. Having a way to dispose of that and any clothing. So if they're wearing aprons for the market in there that they hold stuff in, that instead of just bringing it back and putting it on the hook, that goes back and gets cleaned appropriately with that so that they've got stuff. And then any other additional barriers that are going to prevent contact. So laying out either roped off lanes so that there's a way to get people to move through that farmer's market, using either stickers or chalk to identify how far apart 6 feet is, to make it easy on there. So anything else that you can think of. And I think our farmers are really, as we've said before, very creative. So if you guys have any great ideas, or your farmers do, on what can be used in things like this, or anything we've talked about, please share it with me. I will add it to our FAQ in there so that everybody can see it, because I think at this point we all are in the same boat together, and we need to figure out, utilize all the creativity that we and our farmers especially have to deal with a lot of this.
Sorry, the UPS man's life is in jeopardy.
Oh.
So, a summary. And again, there's a huge amount of overlap in these two sections. We're going to revisit the farm, our flat farm. We're going to do that in a little bit. We're also going to do that self-assessment. We're going to evaluate. We're going to monitor. We're going to revise. We're going to modify. All those wonderful words. Again, they're going to be very site specific. We're looking specifically at this point for SARS-CoV-2, but we also know that a lot of these are best practices for any kind of pathogens. And we're also going to be ready for the next one.
Yep. Okay, so here's the good news. We are down to the last one.